Even though he had
No
regular money.
scars, nothing, but they're there, you know.
Yeah.
That's a tough life as well.
Charles Bronson did not hate easily. He was a man of few words, long silences, and iron discipline. But there was one name that cut through his restraint like a blade. A man he despised more than any villain he ever faced on screen. That name was Richard Boone. This wasn't a petty Hollywood rivalry. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't ego. This was something far deeper. A resentment forged in humiliation, class contempt, and wounded pride, one that Charles Bronson carried with him for the rest of his life. To understand why Bronson's hatred never softened, we must first understand who he was before fame ever found him. Born Charles Dennis Bukinski in 1921, Bronson grew up in a coal mining town in Pennsylvania during the Great Depression. Poverty wasn't an idea, it was survival. As a teenager, after his father died, Bronson descended into the mines himself, his skin blackened with coal dust, his lungs filling with grime, believing this might be his destiny forever. Those years hardened him. They stripped away illusions. They taught him one unbreakable rule: no man had the right to look down on another. World War II reinforced that belief. As a B-29 gunner flying combat missions over Japan, Bronson learned discipline, danger, and silence. He earned a Purple Heart, but more importantly, he earned something else, an authenticity no acting school could teach. When he arrived in Hollywood, Bronson brought that life with him. He didn't pretend. He didn't posture. He endured years of small roles, westerns, crime dramas, parts that barely paid the bills. His rugged face didn't fit the clean-cut image studios wanted, but it was real. And then, early in his television career, he crossed paths with Richard Boone. Boone was everything Bronson wasn't trying to be: educated, polished, confident to the point of arrogance, already successful, already admired. He carried himself like he owned every room he entered and everyone inside it. To Bronson, that attitude wasn't impressive, it was insulting. This was the beginning of a resentment that would only grow sharper with time. When Charles Bronson first worked in the same circles as Richard Boone, the divide between them was immediate and unmistakable. Boone was already riding the wave of television success. His fame from Have Gun, Will Travel gave him status, leverage, and confidence that often curdled into condescension. On set, Boone spoke as if he were the smartest man in the room. He reminded people of his education, his theater background, his intellect. He didn't need to say he was superior. He performed it. To Charles Bronson, that performance was unbearable. Bronson had crawled out of coal mines. He had flown into anti-aircraft fire over Japan. He had earned every inch of ground he stood on. And now here was a man who treated others like furniture. Bronson later recalled how Boone would belittle fellow actors quietly, casually, with words sharp enough to linger. He mocked Bronson's rough appearance, questioned his intelligence, made jokes about his background, comments disguised as wit, but dripping with judgment. They were remarks Bronson never forgot. What cut deepest wasn't just the insults, it was the intent behind them. Bronson believed Boone enjoyed cutting others down, that diminishing someone else made him feel larger. Boone, in Bronson's eyes, didn't want equals. He wanted an audience, and anyone who didn't fit into his world simply didn't matter. Bronson also suspected something darker. He believed Boone used his influence to quietly block opportunities, that he dismissed actors he considered beneath him, that he didn't want competition. especially not from a man whose raw presence threatened to eclipse polish and pretension. Whether Boone truly sabotaged careers or not almost didn't matter anymore. What mattered was how it felt. For Bronson, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was betrayal layered on humiliation. And unlike most Hollywood feuds that fade with time, this one only hardened. Years passed, careers rose and fell. But Bronson's resentment did not soften, it sharpened. Because for a man who had fought his way out of poverty with nothing but endurance, being looked down on was unforgivable. And Richard Boone had crossed that line. By the early 1960s, Charles Bronson's career began to change, but not in the way Hollywood expected. He wasn't suddenly given romantic leads. He wasn't reshaped into a traditional star. Instead, Bronson's presence grew quietly, relentlessly, until it became impossible to ignore. Films like The Magnificent Seven and The Great Escape placed him in ensemble casts, yet audiences remembered him long after the credits rolled. He spoke less than almost anyone on screen, but his silences carried weight. His stillness felt dangerous, real. Europe recognized it first. Italy and France embraced Bronson as something uniquely powerful. An actor who didn't perform toughness, but embodied it. Then came Once Upon a Time in the West. With almost no dialogue, Bronson dominated the screen, his harmonica echoing through the film like a ghost. It was proof that charisma didn't require speeches, only presence. And by the 1970s, Death Wish turned him into an international phenomenon, a cultural lightning rod, and one of the highest paid actors in the world. By any measure, Bronson had won. His fame eventually surpassed that of Richard Boone. His name carried global recognition. His image became iconic. Money, respect, and influence followed. But something unexpected happened. The hatred didn't fade. Bronson never softened when Boone's name came up. Decades later, the bitterness remained intact. He spoke of Boone not with anger, but with something colder, memory, precision. There are people you forgive, Bronson once said. And then there are people you remember exactly as they were. Boone belonged to the second category. Success gave Bronson satisfaction, but it didn't bring closure. Fame couldn't rewrite humiliation. Money couldn't erase contempt. If anything, success only confirmed what Bronson already believed, that he had survived something designed to break him. To Bronson, Boone became more than a man. He became a symbol of Hollywood elitism, of class cruelty, of arrogance disguised as intellect. "I worked too damn hard to be looked down on," Bronson once said, and he never forgot the people who tried. On screen, Charles Bronson looked like a man carved from a stone, a quiet predator, a face that didn't beg for sympathy, didn't ask permission, didn't apologize, but off screen, his life was shaped by something that rarely matched the public image: loyalty. Bronson didn't just value loyalty, he needed it, perhaps because he had grown up in a world where loyalty was survival, where family and hardship were bound together tightly, and where betrayal left scars that never fully healed. That's why his marriages tell a story most people never consider when they think of him. His first marriage was to Harriet Tendler in 1949, long before fame. Back then, he was still Charles Dennis Bukinski, still chasing a career that didn't yet exist. They lived through instability, money problems, and separations as he traveled for any acting work he could find. Harriet became the steady presence in those years, the person holding the ground while he tried to climb out of a struggle. They had 2 children together, and for a time, family was his anchor. But as Bronson's career began to accelerate, the life they built started to crack. Constant travel, growing pressure, and a slow drift of two people pulled in different directions. By 1967, their marriage ended, nearly 2 decades gone, not with a loud explosion, but with the quiet collapse that comes when life becomes bigger than love can hold. Then came Jill Ireland. Meeting her didn't feel like a new relationship, it felt like a turning point. They married in 1968, and Jill became far more than a wife. She was his closest confidant, his creative partner, and the emotional center of his world. She appeared alongside him in many films during the height of his fame, and together they built a blended family, one biological child and later the adoption of a daughter. People who knew Bronson well often said the same thing. Behind the hard man image, he adored Jill. And then life tested them in a way no script could soften. Jill's long public battle with breast cancer became a storm that reshaped everything. Bronson stayed by her side through years of treatment, decline, and fear. The tough man who played relentless survivors on screen was now fighting a private war, one he could not shoot, punch, or intimidate into submission. When Jill Ireland died in 1990, it devastated him, not in a dramatic Hollywood way, but in the way that changes the structure of a person's heart. Years later, in 1998, Bronson married again, Kim Weeks, a former employee of Dove Audio. This final marriage wasn't about public image. It was about companionship, quiet support, and not facing aging alone. It lasted until his death in 2003. In many ways, Bronson's marriages reveal the truth about him. He wasn't driven by glamour, he was driven by devotion, and when he gave loyalty, he expected it in return. Which brings us back to Richard Boone. Because to a man like Bronson, contempt wasn't just rude. It was a violation, a deep insult against everything he had survived. By the time Charles Bronson reached superstardom, most people assumed old grudges would fade. Fame changes things, money changes things, time smooths sharp edges. But Richard Boone was not a sharp edge to Bronson. He was a scar, because Boone didn't just offend him once. In Bronson's mind, Boone represented a whole world of people who believed they were born above others, people who hid arrogance behind culture, who used education like a weapon, who treated toughness as something to mock instead of respect. Bronson prided himself on authenticity. He had no patience for posturing. Boone, by contrast, carried what Bronson saw as intellectual pretension, a habit of reminding everyone he was trained, refined, educated. Boone's superiority wasn't always loud, but it was constant. And for Bronson, that was worse. Loud arrogance can be laughed off. Quiet condescension is meant to sink into your skin. Bronson's resentment became permanent because, as he saw it, Boone never respected him as an equal, and Boone never apologized. That mattered, because Bronson was not the kind of man who needed compliments, but he demanded one thing: basic dignity. He had fought too hard, lived too hard, bled too hard to accept being treated like he was lesser. Over time, Bronson began to speak of Boone with a bitterness that shocked people who knew how private Bronson usually was. He almost never criticized anyone publicly. He kept his thoughts guarded. But Boone was the exception. Bronson believed Boone deliberately belittled him, privately and on set. He believed Boone liked cutting people down, making them smaller so he could feel bigger. He believed Boone didn't want competition, didn't want anyone outside his little world to matter. And here's the twist that makes this feud feel almost tragic. Bronson won. He became bigger than Boone ever was. More famous, more iconic, more financially powerful. The world celebrated Bronson's image, his toughness, his unforgettable stare. Yet even with victory, the resentment stayed. Because Bronson understood something most people learn too late. Money and fame don't erase humiliation. They don't rewrite how someone treated you. They simply prove you survived it. In Bronson's eyes, Boone became the embodiment of a class divide he had been fighting since childhood. Boone wasn't just a difficult colleague. He was the face of Hollywood elitism, cruelty with a smile, arrogance with polished grammar. For a man known for silence and restraint, that lingering hatred spoke louder than any speech ever could. And then, in the last chapter of Bronson's life, something even more devastating arrived. Something no enemy could be punched away. No rival could be outworked. Time. Charles Bronson made a career out of looking unstoppable. He was the man who didn't flinch, the man who didn't plead, the man who could stand in the middle of chaos and still look like he was in control. But life doesn't care about reputation. In the final years of Bronson's life, the iron strength that defined his screen persona began to fade into something quieter, slower, and far more heartbreaking. He was facing Alzheimer's disease. It wasn't a dramatic enemy with a face. It wasn't something he could confront head on. It was a gradual theft of memory, independence, clarity, and the very identity people had come to associate with his name. The man who once communicated emotion through silence now became trapped inside a silence he didn't choose. As his health declined, the physical signs of aging arrived too. In 1998, Bronson underwent hip replacement surgery, a clear signal that time was catching up with the body that had endured decades of demanding work, action roles, and relentless pressure. Friends and family watched him withdraw more and more, his world narrowing as the disease progressed. The commanding presence that once filled a screen now faced a private struggle, away from applause, away from cameras, away from the myth, and then came the end. On August 30th, 2003, Charles Bronson died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Quietly, not as a legend, not as a vigilante hero, not as a man with a gun and a glare, just as a human being whose body and mind had finally reached the limit all people reach. But illness could not erase what he had already become. Because Bronson's legacy wasn't built on big speeches or polished charm, it was built on the survival, on authenticity, on the feeling audiences had when they watched him. This sense that the man on screen had truly lived the hardness he portrayed. And maybe that's why the story of Richard Boone still matters, because Bronson's hatred wasn't simply personal, it was symbolic. It was the wounded pride of a man who had spent his entire life refusing to be looked down on, and who never forgot the moment someone tried. For Bronson, Richard Boone didn't just represent a rival, he represented everything Bronson escaped, everything Bronson fought, everything Bronson refused to become. In the end, the feud between Charles Bronson and Richard Boone was never really about television sets, egos, or competing careers. It was about identity. Bronson did not measure himself by titles or education. He measured himself by what he had endured. Coal mines, warplanes, years of rejection. A lifetime of proving he belonged in rooms that were never built for men like him. So when Boone treated him with condescension, when he mocked his background, questioned his intelligence, or dismissed his worth, it struck at something fundamental, not pride, dignity. That is why the resentment never faded. Bronson wasn't angry because Boone was successful. He was angry because Boone believed success gave him the right to look down on others, and Bronson had spent his entire life fighting that exact idea. Most Hollywood rivalries are loud. They explode in interviews, lawsuits, gossip columns. This one was quiet, carried in memory, preserved in silence, and that silence tells us more about Bronson than any quote ever could. He did not seek revenge. He did not try to humiliate Boone in return. He simply outlived him in relevance, survived the system, and became something Boone never could. An icon built not on polish, but on truth. Bronson understood something brutal and honest about life. You don't always get closure, you don't always get apologies, and sometimes remembering exactly who someone was is the only justice you ever receive. That is why Richard Boone remained fixed in Bronson's mind, not as a rival, but as a reminder of what he escaped, a reminder of what he refused to become. And perhaps that is the most powerful legacy of all. A man who rose from nothing, who spoke little, who loved fiercely, who endured loss, and who never allowed anyone, no matter how educated, famous, or admired, to define his worth. Charles Bronson never wrote a tell-all. He never gave explosive interviews. He never chased sympathy. And yet, through one unresolved hatred, he revealed more about himself than words ever could. Richard Boone was not the villain of Bronson's life. He was the mirror, a reflection of the world Bronson had fought against since childhood, a world where class mattered more than character, where education was used as a shield for arrogance, where men who had never crawled through darkness believed they were entitled to judge those who had. Bronson rejected that world completely. He didn't defeat it with speeches. He defeated it by enduring, by surviving poverty, by surviving war, by surviving Hollywood's rejection, by surviving a grief, loss, illness, and finally, time itself. And when Alzheimer's took his memories, when fame faded, when a strength disappeared, what remained was the truth of who he had always been. A man who demanded dignity, a man who valued loyalty, a man who never forgot how he was treated. That is why the hatred never faded, not because Bronson was bitter, but because he was honest. He understood that forgiveness is a gift, but memory is a boundary, and some boundaries exist to protect the soul. In the end, Charles Bronson didn't need closure. His life became the answer. While one man chased superiority, the other became unforgettable. And sometimes silence really does say everything.